Albert Sanchez-Graells. Welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. It's a pleasure to seeing you, and congratulations on your new book published by Oxford University Press, Digital Technologies and Public Procurement. The topic is fascinating from different perspective. Public procurement plays a pivotal role. We all sense intuitively its fundamental importance for all of us. We meet it in daily routine, but we also understand its direct relevance to competition law in the broader sense, and thus that was direct motivation to invite you for this conversation. But when you look, and I had an honor to read the book, it's fantastic, and the subtitle is of particular relevance for those of us dealing with digital markets, gatekeeping and experimentation in digital public governance. So it must be really nice trigger because we're examining these problems from various perspectives. So I hope we'll have an informative conversation, and you will probably help us to understand better what's going on in other corner of this digital regulatory labyrinth, and maybe we will reflect upon some aspects of it in more details. But I wanted to start with traditional questions about motivation, key objectives of the book.
Okay, no, thank you, Oles. Thank you for having me, and thank you for engaging with Procurement. I'm not sure that everybody finds it so interesting or fundamental, so it's great to have this opportunity to bring it to a broader audience. The motivation was basically how quickly the public sector is just going for technology. And it's been a significant change, you know, in the 2000s and to 2010s, the public sector was really lagging behind the private sector. And then all of a sudden we've gone crazy. It looks like digitalization is going to be the tool for everything. It's going to fix all of the underinvestment in public services through austerity after the financial crisis. It's going to allow hyper-personalization. And I think I started identifying from quite early on that there was a lot of hype. There were lots of very surprising claims being put forward by technology providers. And I saw the public sector basically just taking them. They were not challenging them. So I thought, I'm interested to see if the technology can do as much as it promises to. Back in the time, it started when blockchain was going to be the solution. We will have no corruption because, you know, blockchain can create zero trust environments. And I thought that's too good to be true. And I think it happened. And I think blockchain is very much on the back burner now. We have seen another wave of this with ChatGPT. Now all of the public sector is going to be put on ChatGPT. I hope not. But mainly, I think what I wanted to do with the book is to look at how the public sector is really exposed to things that we know, like regulatory capture, to things like lock-in, to things like unsustainability of decisions made sometimes under these sorts of claims. And with my procurement specialist hat on, I thought procurement is becoming the only regulatory tool available because, you know, it's taken so long to put the EU AI Act in place or the DMA in place. But when I started looking at this in 2017, it was really the Wild West. And I would say even with the AI Act, it remains significantly unregulated. So you have these poor public buyers that don't have the strength that we think they have because they are big. We have a massive skills gap in the public sector. Digital specialists are being attracted by the private sector, higher pay, more fancy things to do. So they are in a very weak position to try to resist all of these claims from the market. They can be easily captured. And then this creates all sorts of governance problems, right? So I think we have a very strong disconnect between, particularly in the UK, very high expectations, very to no or very low risk or low touch regulation, and procurement is caught in the middle, right? They need to try to deliver that without having the regulatory tools. They have to figure it out by themselves. So I thought, well, I'm going to look at whether procurement can do it. And spoiler alert, it can't. And I think that's the main message in the book, that procurement is not the right tool, doesn't have the right competencies. But even if they did, the way that it tries to foster competition, the way that procurement needs to be technology neutral, really prevents making a regulatory intervention to, for example, limit untrustworthy technologies entering the public sector. It's very difficult to do. So I think these are some of the things that we can explore in a bit more of a structured way.
This is really fascinating. I think it's hard to disagree. So several questions emerge immediately about the kind of the hype related to blockchain, and now we have several other buzz phrases which obviously impel the public authorities, those who commission procurements, to also to use it? Do you see that it's mainly done pro forma, or they just do it because there is no other way to do it, or there are some good examples where you can really spot? And because contrary to many other fields, I think it's more or less universal, because the motivation to manage public finance in the most prudent and accountable way is not jurisdiction specific. I think it's kind of first order matter which explains which drives all jurisdictions, or most mature jurisdictions, and thus the room for transposing some technology, or it's too area specific and country specific and culture specific.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's universal, and I think we are, for example, being slow to learn from mistakes done elsewhere. So we know, for example, that there have been big scandals in Australia with the robo-debt approach by the government to try to collect taxes and unpaid social security contributions. That was a massive problem because they automated on the basis of faulty algorithms. The same thing happened in the Netherlands, where we had the city scandal in terms of benefit fraud, that basically made the government come down eventually, because there were masses of people's lives destroyed. There were children taken away from their families on the basis of faulty determinations of fraud. And what I think is universal is this thinking that we can automate things that are complicated, and we can use technology to sort of make everybody comply with their obligations as citizens. But we want to do that on the basis of a technology that in the end, it's nothing but data, right? And I think that's one of the things we are failing to recognize, that we have really poor data in the public sector anywhere in the world. It's not only about poor public procurement data, but we have poor data everywhere. And also the data that we have basically reflects the activities of the public sector until now. We've had public sectors that have been marginalizing communities. We've had public sectors that have been xenophobic in some countries. We have public sectors that have failed to meet their obligations under human rights. And if we plug an AI to that data, the only thing we do is maximize and create mass effects on the basis of that wrong data. So I think that's one of the things that we are failing to recognize, that we don't live in perfect societies. Therefore, any data that reflects those imperfections is not a good foundation on which to plug on AI. And this is not a procurement thing. The other thing that is also quite universal is that we think, oh, we can put technology sort of to support the very boring administrative tasks, because everywhere the approach right now is, well, instead of putting more money into our public services, what we want to do is move money from the back office to the front line, right? So that's a sort of a zero-sum game that we're trying to play as governments. But back office is really important. And I think that the problem with back office is that it's sort of the infrastructure that should make the public sector run. When it works well, nobody acknowledges it. When it works badly, it's a very big problem, right? So we saw it with the procurement of PPE. It looked like procurement didn't know what to do. It was very difficult at the time. So we're trying to automate things that are very complicated, but because the citizens don't see it, we can sort of do it in a bit more of a stealthy way. In the UK, it's also quite interesting to see that the way the public sector is adopting technology is usually for things that the majority of citizens don't experience, right? So we're trying to deploy it for prison management, we try to deploy it for border control, we try to deploy it for fraud detection. And it's always sort of this thinking that the technology can help us dominate or bring back into compliance the less deserving, right? The fraudsters, the foreigners, the inmates. And I think it's a very problematic approach to the deployment of technology. And I think that's what really worries me. It's not about trying to use technology to create efficiencies to save public money. I think that would make a lot of sense. And if we can automate really bureaucratic, zero discretion processes, let's do that, right? So automating the payment of invoices should be relatively uncontroversial. But automating anything that has impacts on people's rights, I think is something we need to think much more carefully about. And that's where the EU AI Act will make a difference, right? So in some things that are high risk, then this will have a structured way of thinking, trying to see fundamental rights impacts and so on. But I think that for other jurisdictions, and particularly for the UK, there is no clear front line of defense, right? And that's when procurement comes in. And for procurement, it's very difficult to resist those claims. So imagine you are in a hospital, right? And all of a sudden the government dangles the carrot saying, well, if you automate your appointment system, we will give you a grant for that, so you can put in an AI in place. And that means you can automatically discontinue whatever many people you have in a call center, and then you can use that money to hire more doctors. It looks like a magic solution, right? But nobody's thinking that trying to make an appointment through an AI requires a level of digital competency, but also it requires for the system to be designed in a way that computer says, no, it's not the end of the story, right? And it also requires, and we have seen it only yesterday, when there was the cyber attack to the blood transfusion provider for hospitals in London, you have to have a plan B. When you rely on operationally on AI so heavily, you need to have a plan B, because otherwise the moment the AI fails, and it will fail, you have no way of putting a stopgap solution, right? So that's the other thing that we're not thinking, is that investing in AI, and until the AI is embedded in a way that is mostly reliable, actually requires investment on top. It's not substitutive investment. It's something that we are trying to develop, but we need to keep the capacity, because the technology will fail us, or somebody will attack against the technology and make us not be able to use it. So there's lots of things that are quite universal, but I think it's more about the failings to tackle those issues and how quickly everyone is buying into the idea that the AI is going to be great. Because, you know, when on a personal level, you can have, say, a doodle poll, and then you avoid having to contact 20 colleagues about when do we have the meeting. You think, oh, this is great, everybody should be using it. But when the stakes are high, when the doodle poll is about how we're going to schedule somebody for urgent surgery, that's a little bit different. And I think that's what we really need to think about. And procurement is not the tool to do that thinking.
And this reminds me, the structure of your and normative parts remind me the reflections by Johnny Ryan about the online advertising machinery, who is also quite skeptical, saying that this hype about online advertising, the omnipotence of online advertising to predict and to do this accurate matching, is very much inflated, and it's not kind of categorical lack of knowledge, and then once all of a sudden we have a miraculous solution by the new technology. But do you think we are moving incrementally towards, and we are just at the footstep of this, at the kind of basic layer of this digital Everest, and maybe in 10, 20 years? So is it incrementally getting a little bit more refined, or it's irresolvable by definition, and there must be qualitative reassessment of the role of AI, let's say, in automatizing our public decision-making processes?
I think that it's very hard to crack, right? So it's very interesting. So for example, Patrick Dunleavy and Helen Margetts just published a paper on how Silicon Valley has completely changed the mindset of managers. And they are a bit optimistic in saying, well, there used to be a claim to say the public sector is different than private sector, because everybody has to engage with the public sector. It's much more sensitive. And also our processes are much more complicated. We are very siloed, and this doesn't happen in the private sector. And they make the claim that more and more it's been demonstrated that the private sector also does very complicated things, that connects different silos, that uses very sensitive data. No? So the online advertisement equivalent is quite helpful here. I think I tend to disagree a little bit with their assessment. And I think the public sector is different in that each of our positions in front of the public sector is determined by so many aspects of it. Some of them are locational, where you live. Some of them are about occupational or circumstantial, about what you're doing right now. Some of them have to do with our status. For example, I'm not a British national, so having settled status creates all sorts of complications. Thinking about people that have multiple nationalities, for example, it's also something that the public sector doesn't deal with very well. So there's a level of hyper complication that is different from, say, the user of a digital platform, where all the digital platform has to know is that they have opted into using this service, therefore they have to have some interest in the service, right? For the public sector, it's more complicated. And also, the public sector has loads of problems integrating things. Let's think about healthcare and social care. It's been a constant problem that transitioning from social care to healthcare and back into social care, it's a massive issue. And these are issues that don't only have to do with the condition of the specific person at the time, has to do with availability in each of them, has to do with budgetary issues, has to do with communication. So I think every single point of intervention that the public sector has to control is quite messy. And we know messiness is not something that algorithms deal well with, right? And I think that's one issue. The other issue is that you cannot trust that the data is good enough because things are not properly recorded, things are not shared in real time. So we all have had a situation where we have moved, we have told the public administration we have moved, and yet they have sent a letter to the old house. We all have had that, right? So that's also basic in saying, if you automate that, if the moment that they send a notification to an email address that is no longer in use, you're deemed notified, we will exclude people. So I think it's quite problematic. The other thing that I usually laugh about when we talk about online advertisement, for example, and this has to do with me having children, is that my device is used by me, by a couple of my children, sometimes by my partner. So the data that is collected through that device basically, I think, describes a schizophrenic person because at the same time you can be very interested in obscure jazz and in Peppa Pig, and I don't know many people that are interested in those things. So I also think that that's something that the AI will not be able to deal with easily, which is the noise when the data is not what we would have thought when we develop an algorithm, right? And I think because we don't get to understand, particularly the complex algorithms, what it draws inferences from, then it's very hard to know that we're going to have a level of accuracy. And again, if this is a video content platform that makes recommendations to me that I think, oh God, this is just for my child, I don't care, it's not a big problem. But if it's a public sector saying, oh, it looks like you have failed to fill in this form, or it looks like you're going to be losing your child benefit because of this or that, then that's much more complicated. And what we need to think about is what is the load that we're putting on the citizen, right? And I think it's very problematic to create a system that is fundamentally externalizing on all of us as citizens a heightened duty to understand what the public sector actually wants from us. We can no longer rely on requests being reasonable or being for a reason. We cannot rely necessarily that decisions are made in a way that align with our best interests. And I think the big problem there is that then it's going to really erode citizen trust and confidence in the public sector, which is not something we should take for granted. I mean, in the UK, and in the context of the general election, it's clear people are really at historical levels of low trust in politicians, in parliament, and increasingly in the civil service. We need to be very careful about that because you know, if the technology actually creates distrust, then I think that scission between the citizens and the public sector will only make the public sector use technology in a way that is just going to fuel that breach, and I wouldn't want that.
In addition to all your current focus, you also have strong connection with competition law, and we understand that public procurement and competition law, the main bifurcation point is, or coupling point is bid rigging, which is a huge problem. Yeah, you don't have to have very rich imagination to see how, if your muscles are well trained, if the markets are inherently oligopolistic, you only have few players with such capabilities to build some infrastructural projects or whatever it is, the opportunities for soft coordination and maybe even more kind of explicit criminal instances of coordination are quite wide. So do we see some progress in terms of detecting maybe fraud? And I imagine that it's a double-edged sword because the companies themselves have access to all these technologies as well. What's the development or state of affair in this part of the sector?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. So there have been attempts to use data-driven approaches to detecting bid rigging, and there are, so the CMA in the UK had its project, which they shelved. And then I know over jurisdictions in Spain, they have a tool that the competition authority uses, although it's not sort of publicly available. And I think that the problem we have there is fundamentally, what is the baseline that we're using, right? So if we are trying to screen markets in almost real time, where you have concentrated markets, where all of the tenders are very similar, where you can trust that the data that comes from the tenders gives you a picture of how the market is moving, then maybe that works a little bit better. So say construction, right? So there's not many people buying construction of schools other than the public sector. So it's pretty much you're a dominant buyer for that specific category. then if you have sufficiently good data collection, and especially if you collect things that usually are not collected, like losing bids, prices of losing bids, and so on, then you can do something about it. The problem in many jurisdictions is that because we have a strong drive for open procurement data to try to create this trust from citizens, right? So we want everybody to see what's going on. The moment you make open the data about who has lost at what prices and so on, that actually reinforces potentially cartels. So we have that problem that we have not thought carefully about what information we need to collect, but just to give it to the contracting authority and the competition authority, but not for everybody else, right? So that's a challenge. The other challenge is that in many markets, the public sector is a minority buyer. Think cars, right? So the public sector buys loads of cars for the police or whatever, but it's small. You know, the private purchasing of cars is a lot more. So trying to analyze what happens in public tenders and say, oh, because there's this repeated winner, then surely there has to be a cartel. Maybe it has nothing to do with that. Maybe it's simply that the requirements of the public sector, because we try to create net zero, because we try to create social benefit, and because whatever, then it could be skewed in a way that doesn't mean that there's anything going amiss. And I'm not sure that you can train an algorithm that will pick up on that. So I think there are advances. I know that in Switzerland, for example, there's people that have been working quite a lot on that, and they have a screening tool that works relatively well, but it's a relatively small jurisdiction, quite functioned along language lines. And I think it works for sectors like construction, but not for commodities, for example. So there's a bit of that. The other thing that worries me a little bit as a lawyer, and as an administrative lawyer, is what is the use of these algorithms, right? Because if you use an algorithm to screen and you say, oh, it looks like this could be a bit rigging, but then you launch a full investigation. And then on the basis of that information coming from the investigation, you open, you send statement of objections or whatever, that seems fine. What I'm worried about is investigations that fundamentally rely on the algorithm said this is potentially a cartel, because I'm not sure this is going to withstand scrutiny and judicial review, especially if we're using very complicated, say, neural networks or other sorts of algorithms, where it's impossible to get an explanation about why this is happening, right? So I think we have also to rethink whether these tools will actually pass muster under our legal tests. And I'm a bit skeptical about people that say, well, what we need to do is reduce the administration duty to provide reasons, right? So we just trust the technology. Well, no, in my view, because in some cases, you would think it's better to catch a cartel than not catch it. But I think it's a very dangerous path when we start reducing duties on the administration to work under due process, because then it's also a very short step between doing that from the nasty cartelists we don't like to the citizens, right? So we need to be careful about that. The other thing is about how to train these things. And it will happen that lots of the times say, well, what we're going to do is look at past behavior, use past data that we have, and then we try to extrapolate cartels. This is happening more in corruption than in cartels. Okay, so we try to train an algorithm to tell us which bids may be corrupt. And the problem is that I think it's very hard to create a database that is going to be reflective of what actually is corrupt and what is not. All we can say is, in this specific case, this was finally found to be a corrupt exercise. But there may be so many other corrupt exercises we never caught that the algorithm will not be able to really pick them up. They will be able to say is, well, if these conditions are met, then you're likely to be convicted in the legal process. But that is not to say these are the conditions under which corruption takes place. So the other risk that we have with using this technology is that it can ossify the understanding of what was, or it can ossify the detection practices that we had. So we cannot just think the algorithm is going to be better at detecting, because in the end, the algorithm is not more than the data that it has been trained with, right, one way or another. So yeah, lots of open questions, but it's very high in the political agenda and in the priorities of competition authorities and anti-corruption authorities to use that sort of screening.
A few questions in this regard. The first one is kind of continuation from the issue which we started with, is that it's one of the very few areas in competition law, sensu lato, where this Washington consensus of universal pan or global competition policy is still reasonable. Yeah, so all jurisdictions are interested in a kind of Interpol style of cooperation and training their other, maybe sharing information or maybe joining efforts in building up this universal database, because it is an interest of all public authorities, regardless of normative or ideological preferences. You want to keep your money under control, and thus you can cross inform each other and build a global public systems somehow. Do we see some examples of such construction, or it's too I don't know, ambitious and unrealistic yet?
So the World Bank and the Inter-American Bank try to create systems for cross-border exchange of information, particularly to exclude tenders that are not reliable, or tenders that are corrupt, or that engage in bid rigging. But I think there is a more worrying underlying trend, which is that consensus is breaking up. Because one of the other phases of procurement, the procurement by waves, is used as a tool of industrial policy. Right? So the state, instead of giving a subsidy, gives you a nice contract, maybe a contract for things that you don't need, or they pay you through the contract. And AI is creating this very much. Every country is using public sector transformation as a playing field of experimentation and as a way of channeling money through the industry. It's also quite problematic, I think, that, for example, the European Union has taken a very protectionist turn in public procurement. So in the last few years, they approved the International Procurement Instrument, which gives the European Commission a tool to exclude tenders from jurisdictions that don't have reciprocal market opening: India, Brazil, China. And also the foreign subsidies regulation, which is important for mergers, but it's also important for procurement. So you can exclude tenders that have received subsidies. And this is very important in sectors like shipyards and shipbuilding and things like this, but also for AI. So I think that the problem with digitalization is that it's putting a lot of pressure in that the countries are trying to do two things at the same time. They're trying to develop a global AI player that will then go and sell that everywhere else, and then be careful in the way they spend money. And that is a tension that is increasingly problematic. And it's also increasingly eroding the capacity of procurement to be this sort of prudent budgetary control, incremental change tool, when basically we are told, for example, 3% of procurement has to go to digital innovation. And then, you know, it's putting the cart before the horses, basically.
So this disillusions me very much, and so there is no Washington consensus in public. I mean, it fits the trend of compartmentalization and more kind of autonomization of competition policy very well. So I'm not particularly surprised, but it's very informative in this regard. But okay, and so let us look at these issues from this more Euro-centered perspective, let's say, and UK-centered perspective. So we have two sisters or twin jurisdictions which have this luxury of do their own experimentalism and cross-fertilize each other in terms of comparative analysis and communication between agencies who have strong links because they've been part of the whole, and also because on an interpersonal level we understand each other very well. So it's kind of twin or family. And do you see that this communication is being already established? Is it just in its infancy stage, or is it just lip service, horizon scan, and all this kind of jargon which tells us little much in terms of real life learning from each other?
So I think it's in this procurement is a bit different than the rest of competition, because in competition you have the ECN and sort of that's a family if you want, and the commission it's in a bit of a strange position. It's not a father or a mother, it's more like an auntie or an uncle, right, to the other ones, and they are doing things that are quite interesting, for example, in trying to plug the gaps before the DMA came in and stuff like that. I think on that, for example, the CMA is probably still a good friend, right? So it's not like a distant cousin, but a good friend. But in procurement, it's very different, because in procurement, what the commission does is very much vertical, because what they do is that they look at whether the member states are complying with procurement rules, and especially when there are European funds involved. So it's less of a collaborative approach, and it's much more an enforcement approach. And on that, when the UK left the European Union, here we didn't create a comparable authority. All of the functions of the European Commission were adopted by Cabinet Office. So it's very much within government. And then it's very much policy driven. And there is not this level of independence. There is not this level. Now there are new rules on procurement coming in October in the UK, and they are trying to create a procurement review unit that should be in charge of trying to ensure compliance, but it will still be within Cabinet Office. So with limited independence, we know that that's very hard to do. In competition law, we know we need independent authorities. In procurement, that's not yet very well understood in the UK. And the other thing is that it's very hard to learn in procurement, even within one same jurisdiction, because it's extremely atomized. So if you look at who are the public buyers in the UK, I think it probably comes to the thousands, because every local authority, every arm's length organization, every university is a public buyer. And it's very, very hard to create systems of knowledge to exchange and even to create institutional memory within different places. So it's quite atomized. The government is trying to do something about it now with the rollout of the new rules, but I think it's quite difficult. And then you have the issue of learning across jurisdictions, and that's when things become even more complicated. So unfortunately, I think because there are not these central points on independent authorities that can then collaborate, I think it's very hard to replicate what happens in other areas.
So all this experimental modality is kind of rather, it's not planned experiments, regulatory experiments, it's rather spontaneous process, and your ability to observe, to learn from other specific cases, basically. So it's very inductive approach rather than top-down holistic perception. There is too much cacophony is going on in this regard. Okay. And another conclusion which I take from this, that when we talk about public procurement, the automatic reference to bid rigging is just a tiny part of the story. The main part is quasi-state aid, or let's say the way to channel public finance to prudently, let's say, or strategically. Okay, so it's very interesting, and maybe you can reflect, Albert, to us. There are some success stories, or it's all just in its infancy, and maybe there are some public some commercial companies who train their muscles and show remarkable examples that they will become essentially the providers or the operators or facilitators of managing for this system in the future. Is there any traces of this already?
So I think what we see is that there are companies that are extremely influential in how the public sector works because of procurement contracts they have. But these are infrastructure platform companies. So Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, because they provide cloud. And I think what we have seen is a massive movement of the public sector to the cloud. Initially because of efficiency, but also because of the pandemic. And I think the difficulty there is that I think there is a very tightly knit oligopolistic competition thing going on in cloud generally, but in the public sector specifically. And I think that there's loads of lock-in happening. There's data lock-in, there's technology lock-in. And what I think is difficult here is to identify a success story. Right? Because you could say, well, for example, is it a success story that the government website is now hosted on the cloud, and the transition meant that there was continuity of service, and maybe now that there's better interoperability, you can use it on your phone, the way you can use it. It could be a success story, but from the governance perspective, the story is much more complicated, because now you have a dependency on this provider that puts you in a very weak position in trying to negotiate things, right? So I think it's hard from the public interest perspective, it's very hard to say whether there are good stories, right? You could say, for example, Amsterdam or Helsinki are cities that are very innovative, and they have developed things that are quite good. For example, in Amsterdam, they developed one mechanism whereby just using a webcam of the public sector vehicles that circulate, like, you know, trucks and buses and so on, they now can pick up where in the city, for example, there's trash that needs being picked. And then they can send a team and pick it up. So it has improved and reduced littering, right? That's a good success story. But there are these sort of quite small operational things, right? There is no big story about saying, I don't know, like Estonia, for example, was touted as a state that is completely digital, everything is done by AI and so on. And now there's literature coming out saying, well, there's actually lots of problems and there's actually lots of social impacts of this approach that is not so clear cut. So I think it's hard to say there are things that are working very well. There's also the issue about how reversible things are or how sustainable they're going to be, right? So and that worries, for example, me a lot in terms of education, right? So we think, oh, we're going to deploy AI in education now because AI can hyper-personalize things, can help people with different types of tests that go to what they know, what they don't know, and so on. Okay, fine. What if in 5 years' time we find that children that are being subjected to this AI develop mental well-being problems? Are we then going to be able to roll it back? Will we still have teachers that can do that? Or there are too many potential failure points further down the line that make me be a little bit skeptical of saying this is clearly a success story. But if you Google success stories procurement digitalization, you will find them. There are different stories whether you can buy them or not.
Okay, then as a clarification, looking at the nature of the phenomenon, and maybe more generally in terms of algorithmization of decision-making processes and public management processes, do you think this increased cacophony, multiplied atomization? I don't want to use the word chaos, but it kind of the inductive rather than deductive nature of the phenomenon. Is it also a part of our liberal democratic governance? And if the technology is in the hand of digital authoritarian regime or totalitarian regime, where all the processes are being under control, let's say, is there a risk that this type of governance can perform better and extract the added value, which then can be scaled up and set up new industrial standard or whatever, or it's kind of utopian or paranoid concern, and they are as problematic for digital authoritarian regimes as the technology is problematic for liberal democratic governance?
So I think it's problematic, and look about planning permissions, right? So in theory, planning is something that you could think is quite straightforward, no? So you live in this specific area, this is listed, therefore, for example, you want to change your windows, it has to be like for like, right? You could automate that, right? So somebody submits an application, says I want to change my windows, and the algorithm says it needs to be like for like, right? If it's not like for like, you cannot change the windows. But that's not the whole story, because when you receive a planning application like that, you can still go to the council and say, but wait a minute, all of my neighbors have changed them. So this thing about this being listed, nobody is respecting it. So now, there is a porosity, or there is an ability to push back when things are not automated, that I think automation excludes or makes a lot more difficult. Also because automation doesn't come alone, right? Automation is not only of the decision making, but it's of the communication and it's of the receipt of your complaint. And at some point, it just makes it so difficult that people will give up. And I think what we will have is a technology barrier to the exercise of democratic rights and values. And that's one thing that worries me. The other thing that worries me is that, of course, by definition, if we start deploying technology, what this technology is very good is at recording absolutely everything, right? So we have a problem that data is not comprehensive, but now we're going to start having a lot more data, and the data will be more integrated. If the way this data is collected is problematic, because something is collected as a data point, I don't challenge it because I cannot give, I don't have the energy or I don't know how to do it, that stays there. And it will keep building a profile that then will feed into other decisions and will snowball. So say, for example, arrests, right? Imagine I go to a demonstration in Bristol and then I get arrested for 5 minutes because the police thinks I was shouting too loud. These crazy rules we have in the UK now. That is going to be a data point that's going to fit into so many other things. And even if usually, it would have meant nothing, or you would have been able to challenge it. So I think that's what really worries me in terms of how the public sector is going to interact with people. There are scholars talking about, for example, empathy and how digitalization and automation makes the state much less empathic and much less able to accommodate differences and so on. For me, I think empathy is a nice way of putting it. I think for me, it's more about the oppression. I think it's a technology that can facilitate oppression and that will exacerbate the inequalities, because there will be people that will be able to afford lawyers. And the next thing is not going to be whether you can afford a lawyer, it's whether you can afford a technologist to demonstrate that that specific decision is problematic. There will be people that don't even know. So I'm really worried also about that, about the inequality it can create and the effects it can create. And because we're moving very fast, this sort of move fast, break things motto is really entering digitalization of public sector. I think we can break things that are really, really important. So I think in the end, if I had to summarize, what would be my hope with this book? What I would like is for it to be clear, we need to regulate this. This is not something that can be left to market transactions. This is not something that can be left to best practices. This is not something that can be left to the self-constraint of the providers of technology to public sector. We need to really carefully regulate this, and we need to slow it down. And there are gains to be had. I would rather delay the gains than embed the losses. And I think that's sort of the anti-hype or anti-establishment mantra that I would like us to think about.
Last question on the substance, Albert. Data Act and Data Governance Act, what's the relevance of these two legislative pieces?
Very, very important, because the public sector holds lots of information, particularly lots of commercially sensitive information. And there is this sort of drive to say, oh, we should make this data available under the Data Governance Act. There's this mechanism for licensing information that is held by the public sector. And I think there are lots of risks to competition, because it's very easy to inadvertently create an illegal information exchange that is mediated by the public sector, like John Deere, like old cases we had. And then on the Data Act, I think that this obligation to share data, the Article 14, 15, or the public sector, in case there is an emergency or in case the public sector is prevented from carrying out a task and there's no other way of accessing the data, could also be problematic. For example, where the state wants to challenge a digital company and maybe tries to use a regulatory approach to try to extract information. So I think that there's loads of potential implications, but the ones that worry me most are the ones that the public sector could just go, okay, we need to make more data available to foster innovation in digital. So all this data is out there now, and now we're going to have all of these anti-competitive effects because people that shouldn't have the data have access to it. So I think we need to be quite careful in that, and the public sector usually doesn't think too much about that sort of competition implication.
That's my concern about the DSA, by the way, going in the same trajectory that we impose requirement on online platforms and online search engines, not only very large, but all to make publicly available annual reports. And I imagine that the data, missing data, will be extracted mainly by those who have these computational capabilities, even if they themselves will be releasing similar reports. But the added value from the market, from this information, which is quite sensitive, for me, but that's a different conversation. So Albert, I wanted to ask maybe as the last question, students, we all hear this hype about AI, large language models, and also obviously public procurement being the sector where the links are quite self-evident. What would be your recommendation in terms of maybe some potentially interesting focus of research, and maybe some don'ts? What should students avoid doing in preparing themselves for very colorful and very rapidly evolving professional career in this sector?
Yeah, I think that the first thing for anyone that wants to engage with the technology is to try to understand it a little bit, because that's the only way you will be able to have a bit of critical thinking about the hype and other things. So one of the things that I did when I was starting this project is just do one of these MOOCs about AI. And it was a little bit painful. It required me to learn a little bit of coding and refresh my institute maths, which were not great. But that really, really helped me, because it's very good to know a little bit from the inside how much data you need to make an algorithm do something so relatively straightforward as classifying a dog and a cat, and how it gets wrong, right? And understanding what are the enablers and what are the constraints of the technology. And I think that's very important. I'm not saying everyone should become a technologist, but I think you should push yourself to try to understand things. There's a very interesting free online course by University of Helsinki, which gives you a first primer on AI. And then you can do something a bit more advanced. I think Coursera has quite a lot of good things. So I would recommend that. And then the other thing I would always recommend is to think about the technology as something that is used in society. So I think and we cannot fall into techno-optimism. I think we need to understand that this is all socio-technical. You know, the AI is not about what the algorithm can do, but who has the algorithm, who determines what it does. Look at the infrastructures of control, place this in a political economy framework. I think if you manage to skill yourself in being a little bit savvy with the tech and a little bit critical about the embedding of the tech, then you're in a very good path to do interesting things.
Albert Sanchez-Graells, thank you very much for this fascinating conversations and congratulations, of course, on your new book.
Thank you. You've been very kind, always. I really enjoyed it.